So Hannah, does it look okay? Okay, excellent. Yeah, please let me know if the internet connection gets unstable or if it gets too loud from background noise or anything. Yeah, as Hannah mentioned, my name is Joey Hulbert. I'm a researcher at WSU. I'm going to introduce our program in a minute, but I do just want to acknowledge that I'm really grateful for this opportunity, and I would love to engage with you all more. And your perspectives are super important to me as members of and residents in the Issaquah area. We'd love to know if you have forest health concerns, if you see anything that you want answers for, or if you think we should do research in. You all are the ones that are out there in the trails, and so we'd love to hear what you're seeing and what you're concerned with, so that we can do actionable and meaningful research about it and try and find solutions. So today we're talking about Western red cedar, which is an example of one of our key species that's having trouble. And there's a lot of community members like yourselves that are really concerned. And so we selected it as our priority project for the Forest Health Watch because of the enormous amount of concern around it, but also because of its extreme importance in terms of its role in our ancestral and industrial heritage in the Northwest. So I'm going to talk about that a little more. I'll just see there's one chat thing. Okay, thanks for sharing that. So I'll give a little introduction to the Forest Health Watch in a few minutes, but I'm going to start off by introducing myself and the program that I come from. And like Hannah acknowledged, I also want to acknowledge that I'm really privileged to be learning and exploring and researching and studying and just having fun on these traditional homelands of the Coast Salish peoples. Normally I'm here. Can you see my mouse? I'm sorry. Okay, cool. Normally I'm here in Tacoma, so on the traditional homelands of the Puyallup tribe of Indians, which is an incredible place to live and learn. And we have a research center that's at Puyallup, and so that's where I spend a lot of my time. Today, I think I'm actually on the traditional homelands of maybe Chelan or maybe the Entiat. I'm actually coming to you today from Leavenworth as I'm traveling for some field work that I'll just briefly share in a few minutes. But yeah, this nativeland.ca is a really cool tool if you ever want to explore the kind of territories that you're occupying or visiting and see some of the native peoples and traditional kind of ancestral homelands of some of the native peoples in the Northwest. So with that in mind, I'm going to introduce our research program at Puyallup and talk a little bit about my background. So I actually have done a full circle. I started out at Washington State University doing forestry and natural resources, and then I spent some time in Oregon. And then after that, I went to South Africa and I studied plant diseases in South Africa, and I returned in 2020 just before the pandemic and everything locked down. So really, really fortunate to get to do some incredible traveling and experience some cultures around the world as part of my studies. And I'm really grateful that I'm back in the Northwest and working for WSU. And I really owe this opportunity to the USDA. They are providing a postdoctoral fellowship, which is covering my salary and help provide the startup funds for the Forest Health Watch. And so this program and my fellowship is based at Washington State University, and we're really based at this Research and Extension Center in Puyallup. And I'd just like to highlight this because I want to emphasize that we're totally there as resources to you all. The program that I'm in really focuses on tree health. And so, in terms of forests and the native lands in the Issaquah area, we're there as a resource. If you have questions or concerns or would just like to know more about certain things. This is an example of some of the things we research. there's a disease called sudden oak death in California and Oregon, and occasionally it'll pop up in Washington, not on our oaks, but on things like rhododendrons. So we work with nurseries and plant producers to ensure that they're not accidentally spreading organisms that cause diseases like sudden oak death, but also that they can be better equipped to deal with these kind of organisms. So yeah, a big part of our program, we're called the Ornamental Plant Pathology Program because we work with ornamental plant producers to ensure that they're not spreading diseases and that they know how and have the means to prevent kind of epidemics or pandemics in their nurseries from plant disease organisms. We also work on Madrone. I'm going to speak about that a little bit more. We have a common garden. We have 2 common garden sites in Puyallup, which means we're doing this kind of research where we have 113 different families of Pacific Madrone growing in one spot. So they're seed collected from throughout the West, and we're interested in knowing, which of those seed are better for climate adaptation and which populations might be better at kind of tolerating or resisting the late blight, or not the late blight, but the leaf blight. And then in addition to that, we work with Christmas tree growers, and we've recently started focusing on a tree disease called sooty bark disease on maples. And I'm going to speak about these a little bit more, but I did want to say that if you love Pacific Madrone like we do, we really encourage you to join this community. It's kind of similar to the Forest Health Watch. It's kind of a citizen science thing, but it's more of a community where we really like to bring webinars together that feature other researchers doing work and working on Madrone or Arbutus. And so once or twice a year, we'll have webinars about the Arbutus Army, about Pacific Madrone. If you're from BC, you might refer to Madrone or Madrona as Arbutus. Arbutus is the genus for Pacific Madrone, and the species epithet is menziesii. So it's Arbutus menziesii. So the shorthand for that is ARME. So that's why we call it the Arbutus Army. But yeah, please engage with us in that if you are interested in learning more about Madrone. It's a really iconic species in the Northwest, and we'd love to share our love with you. So in addition to those research projects that I mentioned, this is a photo I took today where we're busy sampling streams on the east side of the Cascades, looking for those same microorganisms that cause disease like sudden oak death. So we kind of have a microbiology study looking at which plant disease causing microbes are in the streams and in some eastern Cascade rivers. So this was near Rimrock. We also are sampling some streams in Cle Elum area, and then now up in Leavenworth. That's what brought me to Leavenworth today. But all of this, that's just a quick introduction to who we are at WSU and Puyallup. That's just one program at that research center, but we're there as a resource. We'd love to come and do a hike with you. We'd love to come and share about our research, host you for a tour, those kind of things. But least of all, please feel free to email me or anyone in our program if we can be of resource to you. So I'm going to shift gears now and get to the core of this discussion, Western red cedar. Thanks again, Hannah, for sharing my contact details in the chat. I would really love to know. I'm going to show some photos in a few minutes of like the dieback that we're seeing. And at that time, it would be great to know if you all have seen similar things to that, or if you're also kind of concerned about red cedar. Before I start showing you some of what we're seeing and why we're concerned with red cedar, I want to just kind of summarize why Western red cedar is really important to the Northwest and to us and to the indigenous populations and communities in the Northwest. So first of all, Western red cedar, you may hear it called the tree of life. There are many gifts, if you will, that red cedar provides to indigenous communities and has provided since time immemorial. Some of those gifts include, products for building and transportation, like these canoes, other products like shelter, and then of course, mini baskets are still woven from the bark of Western red cedar today. So it's a really important cultural resource that we should be working to ensure exists for future generations and allows this tradition to be passed down. So again, this is just emphasizing, this is a page from Heidi Bohan's book, People of Cascadia. Really, again, just emphasizes all the various gifts that Western red cedar provides. It's often referred to as a really generous tree, a really generous species. So for this reason, we want to keep Western red cedar on the landscapes. It's the reason it's our first really focus as the Forest Health Watch, and we really need folks like yourselves to get involved and help understand what's going on with Western red cedar. This photo on the right, sorry if you see me like moving the screen around, but I have to move the video to see some of these things for you all on my side. But this was a cedar bough wrapped from twine from the cedar bark and given to me. And the implication was that if I clip some pieces off of, if I dry it first and then I clip little bits of it off and I drop it into steaming water, the steam is actually a good cleanser for symptoms, respiratory issues, and symptoms like what you would get if you had COVID, actually. So that's a little bit of indigenous knowledge that was shared with me and that I'm sharing with you all about the importance of Western red cedar. I was also advised, be careful, seek a traditional healer to talk about the amounts of red cedar to use, because it's really powerful and you want to be careful and respectful. In addition to the cultural importance of Western red cedar, it has a really important role in our industrial heritage in the Northwest. And I don't know the history of Issaquah that well. It was probably a mill town at some point, like a lot of Northwest cities. I'm in Tacoma, where our waterfront was at 1.9 different mills. And the reason that we had such a amazing forestry community is because of the natural timbers that we had, including Western red cedar. And so all these historical photos from the Washington State Historical Society really illustrate kind of the diversity of uses of red cedar, but also how they were just important products from our forests that helped founded our cities in the Northwest. So in that bottom left is actually the Ballard Lumber Company, and these are all cedar planks. And then on the top right, those are all cedar shingles or checks, or I think you would call them shakes sometimes. And these were used for roofing and I think that was their primary use, like shingle roofs. But yeah, I love this middle photo. Western red cedar, the endearing wood of the ages. It's really well recognized for its durability and resistance to rot. So it's the reason we use red cedar for our fences and for our raised garden beds and things like that in the Northwest. It's really incredible wood product. So in addition to the cultural and industrial heritage and the role that is played in the legacy of the peoples of the Northwest, it's also really important ecologically. Sometimes you can find entire stands of Western red cedar where it's the only species surviving, and that may be because it's in the middle of a root rot pocket. It's the only tree that's able to cope with that root rot. But it's contributing important services like stabilizing the soil. Sometimes red cedar grows right on the stream bank, where it's holding that riverbank together essentially, but also providing shade for those streams and the salmon that live in those streams and helping regulate that stream temperature. So it's really important for habitat as well. I love to just illustrate its importance in the urban environment. Like me, I live in Tacoma, and maybe the ecological services are not readily beneficial to me in my daily life. But if you think about Red Cedar in the urban landscape, it's also really important and has a large footprint. So on the top right here, we have a map of Seattle, and these are all the blue dots are Western red cedar trees that are street trees in Seattle. And there's about 1,600 trees in Seattle that are Western red cedar. So it has an enormous footprint in Seattle and the urban environment, where it's contributing really important services like reducing the effect of heat islands, simply just providing shade and offsetting the cost of electricity to run air conditioners, but also, improving the walkability and the kind of the aesthetic and the appeal of the city, which has been linked with like mental health and well-being. Yeah, this is a really nice article that summarizes kind of the value of urban trees, and I encourage you to check it out. It's on darkmatter.org. You can Google trees as infrastructure. But really just emphasizing that Western red cedar is an important part of our Northwest forests and our Northwest urban forests. And we did have kind of a storyboard about red cedar specifically in Seattle at our webpage, Stat Seattle. So in addition to the footprint in the urban environment, Western red cedar has an enormous footprint in the Northwest. This is the distribution of Western red cedar as far as we know. And then on the right here is all of the Western red cedar that's been shared on iNaturalist. What's interesting is that some of the densest stands of red cedar, some of the kind of the areas where you'll find the most board foot of red cedar, if you will, is actually in northern Idaho and this western Montana area. And so although we'll find pure stands in the kind of the coastal western Washington area, it's playing a pretty big role in that northern Idaho area as well, up into BC, of course. So we know Western red cedar is really important. We know it's an important part of the cultural legacy. We know it's a really important part of our industrial heritage and continues to remain an important part of our industrial heritage. It provides a lot of services ecologically, both naturally in the natural environment and the urban environment. And we know it has a really robust distribution or a large footprint on our landscape. So for all of these reasons, it's really important that we keep Western red cedar healthy if we can, and we try our best to ensure that it remains on the landscape as a resource for future generations. However, there's enormous concern. We're really concerned with Western red cedar because we're seeing a lot of dieback. So sometimes this is characterized by an entire tree dying. Sometimes the crown gets really thin and easy to see through. Sometimes just the top dies, and then over a couple of years it will die. Sometimes it's in the middle of a forest, and sometimes it's on a forest edge. Sometimes it's in our urban forests, but it seems like it's happening across the board. In a lot of, especially in Western Washington, it's hard to go somewhere where you don't see this. So I do encourage you, if you have seen this, maybe comment in the chat, or maybe, maybe you haven't seen it. That's okay too. Maybe it's not as bad. I originally had a hypothesis that it was only occurring in lower elevations, but now even as you drive over I-90 out of Issaquah, you'll see it along I-90 up into some of the higher elevations. So it doesn't seem like it's an elevational issue, but I would be interested to hear your perspectives on where you're seeing it, where you're not. I know Anne has mentioned she has many very healthy red cedar in her neighborhood or her community and property, and that's really lovely to hear. We're very interested in knowing where trees are healthy as well as where trees are unhealthy. So here's some photos that have been shared from community scientists in Portland, Oregon. Here's some from the Seattle area. Again, just really this characteristic top dieback. Sometimes, like on this photo on the far left, you see the trees still have all their very fine branches, which indicates that this recently died. The top recently died on this. Other times, you'll see these really old growth trees with just a spike top and no branches, and you know that that top died sometime in the last 10 years, probably, or maybe longer. But yeah, what we're seeing often is these trees with a lot of really fine branches. They just dropped their needles in the past year or two. And then finally, here's some more photos. This is from Radu. They're pretty incredible community scientists out of Vancouver, British Columbia. So I really just wanted to illustrate that we're seeing this throughout the range in Western Washington, from at least Oregon to British Columbia. This has been highlighted in many news sources. So if you Google Western red cedar dieback, you won't struggle to find some concerns in the news, like NPR. There's a lot coming out of BC, where Western red cedar is their provincial tree. But yeah, there's some local ones. So Vancouver, Parksville, Washington's dying foliage. So, this is all kind of illustrating the concern. There's concern from scientists and there's concern from the general public. This increase in dieback is also noted through our aerial survey data. So every year, the Forest Service, in partnership with Washington DNR and even Oregon Department of Forestry, they fly airplanes over our forests, as much of our forests as they can. And they map areas where they're seeing tree health issues. And so in 2017, they started noting, oh, we need to start tracking Western red cedar dieback. We're starting to see more and more as we fly. And so every year they've kind of been seeing more and more. And so this is getting pretty well documented. You can see that it's where's this qua on this map? Probably like somewhere over here, maybe right here. There's some specks in there around Issaquah. It seems like there's a lot on the Olympics and a lot in the Puget Sound region, or excuse me, the San Juans. And so generally, the consensus is that this is happening because of longer and hotter droughts, and that makes sense because Western red cedar is kind of a water-loving species, but it does seem more complex than that. It does seem like some trees that you would expect to be unhealthy, like on the top of slopes, are not the ones that are unhealthy, where the ones that are in the river bottoms are the ones that are showing this top dieback. And so we have a couple hypotheses for that, and we can talk about it, but it is it's certainly plausible that this is completely driven by changes in temperature or longer and hotter droughts in the summer. But we really want to know which exact environmental parameter is the best for explaining where this is occurring and where it is not. For example, is precipitation the driving factor? Changes in temperature the driving factor? We don't quite understand which variable is the most important for understanding this issue. And so, there's a lot of concern. It's a really important species. But the reason that this is so urgent is because we really we're recognizing the effects of climate change, and we want to adapt. We want to plant forested species that are going to do well in warmer and drier climates. And people are already moving away from Western red cedar, which could be a tragedy when we think about how important it is to the indigenous peoples and the traditional uses of it, and kind of the traditions in the Northwest. And so we want to we don't want to just give up on red cedar yet. We want to experiment. We want to try some, are there silvicultural treatments? Can we thin trees to keep trees healthy? Or can we plant trees from different populations? Like if we have trees from Montana or trees from California, are they going to do better than trees from British Columbia? We're just starting to explore those kind of questions. And it's really, it's really important we do these next steps and we don't just abandon red cedar. And so we're asking you all to get involved as community scientists, because we can really accelerate research about this issue. We can identify together, we can map where healthy trees and unhealthy trees are, so that we can figure out which environmental parameter is the most important. And with that information, then we can start to screen other tree populations, or we can start to model where trees and which communities will be vulnerable to dieback and things like that. So I'm going to go into that a little bit more. But now I'm going to talk about the community science aspect. We're first going to talk about the whole program of the Forest Health Watch and what it is. And then we're going to specifically talk about how you can get involved as community scientists if you want to. So the Forest Health Watch, it's really this idea. We want to build a network of community scientists that are interested about tree health. And the first project, as I've mentioned, is focused on red cedar, but this is where we'd love to hear your perspective, because, what's the next project about? Folks around Issaquah have said, our red cedar looked great, but our Western hemlock looked terrible. And so maybe our next project needs to be about Western hemlock, but we really want to hear your perspectives on that and have your input about which direction to go. So within the Forest Health Watch, there's a lot of ways to get engaged with us. And I'm not going to go through all of these bullets, but I do want to highlight that every month I have office hours where there's just a lot of time that anyone can come and ask questions and get answers. We also do these monthly research updates. So it will be a little different than this, where every month, we just did this on Monday, we have a Western red cedar dieback map research update. And so we look at the data together and we look at what's being shared by community scientists, and we try and be really transparent about how that data or how those observations are informing our decisions or will be useful in the models and things like that. Just briefly wanted to mention that although we're really focused on Western red cedar, we're very interested in tracking some of these other tree health issues that keep coming up. So for example, there's a project. This is kind of an very old slide. But there's a project where you can map unhealthy and healthy Western hemlocks, and then we can kind of do the same sort of approach with Western hemlock in the future. So far we're really focused on this Western red cedar dieback, and I'm going to talk about how you all can contribute to that if you're interested. But we're also concerned and interested to hear what you think about Western hemlock dieback. It seems to be a little bit different agent, where sometimes we see trees dying from the bottom up rather than from the top down. But sometimes we see, like this tree's in Point Defiance, hemlock's dying from the top down, kind of like we're seeing with Western red cedar. Other times we see the foliage and the lower canopy die first, which might indicate there's a disease or a pathogen involved. Grand fir, kind of a drier species, so it might not be there in Issaquah very much, but out on the San Juans or some of the drier areas of Western Washington, definitely out east on the eastern side, we're hearing a lot about grand fir dieback. And so given that it's kind of a drier species, it's probably also really affected by longer and hotter droughts or longer dry periods. Big leaf maple dieback, you probably have seen just this past couple weeks. University of Washington released or published a paper and released a press release connecting this dieback to longer and hotter droughts. So again, just illustrating, providing some evidence of that the effects of climate change can be seen in our communities. However, there may be another factor involved that hasn't been well documented or is just kind of emerging and wasn't maybe overlooked until this point, but our lab is we just got some funding and we're just ramping up and exploring with cities this emergence of a disease called sooty bark disease. And so you can't see it on the outside of a tree until the tree is really, really in poor shape. Then this kind of sooty patches start to emerge where the bark pops off and you see this black staining underneath or this black staining inside the tree. So there's a new fungus. Well, it's not a new fungus. It's a fungus that's been in the region for 70 years, as far as we know. But it's favored by warmer climates, and also when the trees become stressed from hotter and longer droughts, then the combination of the two, a weakened host and a more aggressive pathogen, is leading to the emergence of this disease. And so there's a Seattle Times article that got some things right about it, but you can see it's in Seattle, and we're working with cities. I think there's someone in Issaquah who may be sending us some samples from the city of Issaquah, but this is generally what to keep an eye out for. Once the tree is in pretty bad shape, you'll see the bark kind of pop off, and then there's this sooty residue. These are the fungal spores. It's kind of like a mat of fungal spores underneath of the bark. So the primary distinction here is that if you see black on the outside of the bark, that's not something that's probably affecting the health of the tree. But if you see the bark popping off and you see this, then we want to know, because we don't know the distribution of this disease, and we don't know the diversity of trees that can be affected. Yeah, so there's a lot of research. It's early days in that, but I just wanted to highlight that this is another project that will likely be focused on as part of the Forest Health Watch. And then finally, I think the last one I was going to highlight is this red alder dieback. And so red alder seems to be another water-loving species. You find it along streams. It's really important, again, for salmon habitat and stream temperatures, but we're starting to see a lot more top dieback, and we're particularly interested in whether there's some root disease associated with this, because we know alder is pretty susceptible to those microbes that we're sampling in the rivers, for example. Happy to talk about that more, but we should get back to the red cedar in a second. The last thing I was going to highlight is that this is outdated, but every month we do these biosurveillance trainings. So there's one coming up on Monday. And in this, we really just highlight invasive species to look out for, invasive forest insects and forest tree pests, insect pests, and some diseases to look out for. And so that's kind of a different type of training. We're really more focused on what are the new insects to watch out for on our walks, and what are the new symptoms to look out for. So in addition, on Wednesday, we did a sooty bark disease information session, and we have one more of these coming up in November. And so that's another option if you want to learn a little bit more about this sooty bark disease, but these are all offered through the Forest Health Watch program. The final thing I was going to highlight is that we do have 3 active hypothesis tests going on. So the one that's probably most relevant to you all is that King County recently released this surface heat temperature data. And so in summer 2020, they drove around the King County, and they collected surface temperature data at different times of the day. And so now we're interested in testing this hypothesis that red cedar trees will be less healthy in hotter areas. And so what we've done is we got street tree data from 8 cities in King County. Unfortunately, not Issaquah, sorry. I can't remember if Issaquah didn't have the data. I think that was the case, or what the reason was for why I couldn't get the data from Issaquah. But for the cities in the region that provided street tree data, we picked out some Western red cedars at different surface temperatures. And so we're intentionally asking people to go to these specific trees and then use the iNaturalist to document the health as a way to directly test the hypothesis that trees in hotter areas will be less healthy. And so through this direct hypothesis test, we'll be able to confirm or deny the importance of heat and surface temperature in the health of red cedar. And so it's kind of a fun way to get involved. We are doing something similar in Seattle, specifically with the historical redlining maps, where we're interested in if trees in redlined areas are less healthy than trees in non-redlined areas. And we're doing the same thing in Portland. And what's incredible is there's like some community scientists. It hasn't we haven't promoted it so much in Seattle, but in Portland, there's community scientists literally biking around the city to visit these specific trees. And it's just really, really fun to watch happen and see this kind of cool way. And I think they're having fun having a destination for their hikes or for their walks or their bike rides. So similar to you all, maybe if you want to take a drive and get out of town, there's all these trees. We'd love to have some data on those. So, okay, kind of the bigger chunk that we got to get through now is just how community scientists are getting involved. And so with some colleagues from Oregon Department of Forestry, the Forest Health and Protection, and Washington DNR, we developed this project iNaturalist. And so these colleagues actually have their own kind of internal within the Forest Service version of this, but it's a little more robust. And so we work with them to just extend it to a public audience. And by using iNaturalist, anyone can contribute. And so I do want to emphasize that you don't have to use it on your phone. You can use it from your computer. Really, all we need is a photo and a GPS point. And then we ask that you indicate, is the tree healthy or unhealthy? And with that information, we can do so much. And so we chose this iNaturalist tool. And when I say we can do so much, I'm going to tell you what we can do with it in a few minutes. So you don't have to just take my word for it. I'll show you how that data is useful. But we chose iNaturalist because there's already almost 4 million people using iNaturalist. It's been used for a lot of different projects, and there's already 300,000 different species have been shared on there across 64 million different observations have been shared. So it's a really popular tool. They've got it pretty well figured out. And what's pretty cool is we can make one project like about Western red cedar, and then pretty much use those same questions for other projects if they fit. So we've been able to make multiple projects for other species with the same kind of intent. So generally how it works is you can take a picture of any organism and you share it online, and that community helps you identify what it is. And then in some cases, it will go further. For example, you might be the first person to observe some really rare salamander in Washington. This happened in the Olympics. Then Washington Fish and Wildlife might contact you or reply to your observation and be like, wow, this is super rare, or it's endangered or threatened. We want to go out and do more surveys. Do you want to come with us? And so that's a pretty cool story that's happened in the Olympics by just posting a picture using iNaturalist. The way we use it is slightly different, where it's a little more intentional. We've created a project on iNaturalist, and we ask people to join the project and then add observations to it. And so the way you would do it is and these are really outdated. There's more than 1,000 observations so far, but the way it works is you can visit the web page and you can join the project, or you can find the project on the app and join it that way. But then when you're adding an observation, you add some photos of red cedar, and then you identify it as red cedar, and the community will agree or disagree. But then you tag the project, Western Red Cedar Dieback map. And when you do that, it asks a few other questions. So it asks, what did you see? Was the tree really easy to see through? Did the tree have a dead top? Was the tree completely brown or dead? Also ask, was it in a field, or was it next to a road, or is it in the middle of a forest? But then we also ask, are there how many trees within sight are unhealthy, to get an idea of how severe that spot is. We also ask that you look for other possible factors. It seems like that in some cases there will be evidence of a fungus attacking that red cedar, or insects boring into it, or bark beetles living in between the wood and the bark. And all of these we suspect are adding to the condition of that tree. So it's important that we document what other factors might be affecting the health of that tree. So again, this is just some examples of fungi that we've seen on red cedar. So this is armillaria. It's sometimes called the honey fungus. It's Western red cedar is generally thought to be tolerant and can cope with armillaria. On the stand, for example, you might be in a spot where there's no other Douglas fir or Western hemlock, or some of the other species that might be susceptible to the armillaria, but there's a lot of red cedar. But in some cases, we've found armillaria on red cedar, affecting red cedar. And so, that's kind of raising questions about whether these longer and hotter summer droughts are making these red cedar more vulnerable to some of these fungal pathogens, or some of these native organisms that have been kind of coping with for long periods, for hundreds of years. But now we're just seeing kind of the tipping of that scale, or the teetering of that scale, if you will. Other things to look for, this is what we call frass. It's like beetle excrement. It's the sawdust that the beetle kicks out. Sometimes you'll just see frass, and sometimes you'll see a lot at the base of the tree. Other times you might just see really small insect holes. Those are pretty important to note, especially if the tree is still alive. A lot of these bark beetles and insects are known to come in after the tree is dead as secondary organisms. But if you see it attacking a living tree, then that's important to note. So bark beetles leave these, what we call galleries. And what's pretty cool is you can identify what insect it is based on the pattern of the gallery. So, even outside of red cedar, there's a lot of other bark beetles that affect our trees. But they're pretty cute little guys, are little individuals that make these really neat, intricate patterns, where I can go into why they make those patterns, but for the sake of time, I'll just move on. So we also have some, like a dashboard that shows you what's being shared by by community scientists. And so I think, did it travel with us, Hannah? Are you looking at a web page now? Okay. Yeah, so this is the web page. It's just, if you type in foresthealth.org/analyses, you can come to this dashboard any day. It updates on its own every day. So you can see that there's, 1,100, almost 1,200 observations have been shared, and by 100 and almost 170 people. And we really want to get to 2,000 by the end of the year. I don't know if we'll make it, but we still have this robust, pretty great coverage, at least of Western Washington. Our coverage out east is really limited. So we would love more observations out east. That's a pretty enormous gap, and our understanding of what's going on with the health of trees is pretty limited out there. But even if we went into kind of the Issaquah area, you can see, forgive me if I'm in the wrong spot. Let's see.
Joey, we might not actually be following you. There's a screen. It might just be your slides. That's a picture of the dashboard.
Oh,
that I was confused about.
okay. Well, if you go to this webpage, so you're just looking at my slide?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. Did it advance? Okay. If you go to that webpage, you can actually zoom in on these dots and play around and look and see who the top observers are in your area and what's going on. So there's two dashboards. There's one that shows you all the community science contributions, which I guess if you would have got there with me, you would have seen it's more updated than these slides. But you can click on kind of each individual and see who the rock star is in that region. There's some, like Alexis in this case, has really covered Portland super well. And so there's some really cool individuals. But there's also this other dashboard where you can click on the different health categories and see where healthy trees are, where unhealthy trees are. We can try that again after we finish this presentation if you're interested. So the last little bit is just to explain why this information is useful, why, what we can do from just a GPS point and knowing where trees are healthy and unhealthy is pretty amazing. So first we can really start to identify areas that are kind of the worst off, or like start to identify areas of concern. So what's really cool is, from starting this, we really got a better understanding of oh, this is actually occurring in Canada as well. It's occurring in Oregon. You would expect if it was completely climate driven, that it would be way worse in Oregon than it is in British Columbia, but we're really seeing it throughout the range. All the way up to Alaska. Actually, Alaska has some trees that are top dieback, but I just heard this past week they might have a different insect issue, and they're still trying to tease that out. But then also through all the questions that we asked, we're starting to get an idea of different patterns that we're seeing in the site conditions. Is it trees that are near water or trees that are upland that are more vulnerable? What size class are most affected? Where in the landscape is it? But the really exciting part to me is kind of what we can do with this next bit, with the climate data and with the topography data and the soils data. So when you just have a GPS point, so we're going to do, you could say modeling, some sort of hypothesis testing, but it's a regression where we have a binary response where we have whether the tree is healthy or not. So you could have a 1 or a 0 if you want to follow me really down the rabbit hole. And then what you're trying to do is predict and identify what the best predictors of that tree being a 1 or 0 is. And so we can explore all these different environmental predictors like temperature and precipitation, but not just as simple as that. It's, do we want to look at temperature during July, or do we want to look at the mean annual temperature, or do we want to look at the coldest month temperature? And then similarly, do we want to look at number of days without precipitation? Do we want to only look at the number of days in the summer, or do we want to look at the year-round number of days with precipitation? So there's all these different ways to kind of quantify and measure what's going on in the environment. And it's really hard to understand or to guess which one of those is going to be the most important predictor without doing some of this exploring. And I'm going to show you why that's in a second. But also from a GPS point, we can pull in data like the elevation, the slope of that individual spot. We can pull in the aspect, which is the direction that the tree is facing. And through that, you can calculate things like the heat load of that given site. And so you can pull in all these different topographic predictors. So we could say, then you can do combinations, trees at this slope are best predicted by this environmental parameter. And I don't want to get too deep down that, but the last thing we want to involve too is the soils data. And so we can look at things like soils depth. Is that an important predictor of whether red cedar is unhealthy or healthy? And through all of this, we can start to identify where are trees vulnerable and where should we work harder to protect these trees. Through this, we'll also be able to improve the use of a tool like the seed lot selection tool. And so this is a really cool tool where right now you can say, I want to plant Western red cedar on the tip of the Olympics right here. And I want to plant red cedar that's going to do well between 2040 and 2070. So this is using climate predictions with this degree of certainty. But then the final thing it asks you is it says, okay, how do you want to select your red cedar? What environmental predictor do you want to use to make this decision? And so this is, again, do we want to use mean annual precipitation or do we want to use mean annual temperature? So these are all the predictors that we're going to test first off, and just so we can use this tool better. So for example, if we pick mean annual temperature and we say we want to plant red cedar in this top of the Olympics, that's going to do well in 2040 through 2070. So it's saying, okay, you should try and get seed from this Willamette Valley, the dark red area of Oregon. Now let's switch it up and let's say we want to base this on precipitation. So now we're talking mean annual precipitation. Well, now it's saying, okay, you want to get these trees from the coast of Oregon or maybe the Cascades. So you can see that depending on the environmental predictor we pick, you get different suggestions and recommendations. So it's really important that we try and figure out the best predictor for where trees are healthy. And we can totally do this by with the help of community scientists like yourselves. And so this is the tool we use to get all the climate data for given GPS points. It's called Climate NA, made from an incredible lab in British Columbia. And so we can take climate data, tree data, and we can start to explore, are there differences where trees are healthy compared to where trees are dead, or where trees have thinning canopies, or where trees have dead tops. And so this is kind of where we're going. This is where we're at now. We're just starting to explore these environmental parameters because now we have more than 1,000 data points to play with. And so eventually, what we really want to be able to do is knowing where trees are vulnerable and knowing which environmental parameters are important, we can start to screen these other populations and see which ones are going to be the best suited for those areas in the future. So yeah, I hope that I did a good job illustrating that, we can do a lot with your help, and really by sharing what you're seeing, you can really help accelerate the research and help us ensure that we can keep red cedar on the landscape. So yeah, I can't thank you enough for this opportunity to share our work, and I really hope that there's something interesting in here for you and that we can engage further. So I'd love to hear your perspectives and your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Joey. Really quick, I see Paul has a question. I just want to mention that Joey and I talked about having a follow-up meeting with anyone who's interested in becoming a citizen scientist. So I'm going to drop a link in the chat to a Google form that you can fill out if you want to participate in that. So we don't have a date for that set yet. We just wanted to see what level of interest we have in that. So
cool. Yeah, if you want to get together and do some of this in person, then please fill out that form and we'll make it happen. That sounds fun. You might get rained on, but I trust that you all are used to that.
yeah, Paul, do you want to come off mute and ask your question?
All right, thanks so much, Hannah. Hey, Joey, thanks so much for being here and for sharing your research. It was very interesting, and also for the intro where you kind of talked a lot about the cedar and its cultural and significance, and really grounding us in that. We had a pretty extreme weather event this summer with the heat wave, and I even noticed within a few weeks, or probably within a month after that event, even some Douglas firs on my property looked like they had been impacted. And I started reading about sunburn and how just that event impacted. And it may not have, it just like a sunburn might heal on a human. I'm not sure what it would do to a tree, but it seemed like that event had a big impact. Well, something like that, because I know I did go to your website beforehand, and I know that extreme events are some of the things you're going to try to understand their impact to this overall health. There's something like what we experienced this summer. Is that just going to be seen as part of this potentially ongoing problem that the cedars are facing? Or can it maybe like skew your data and actually introduce some type of damage or bad health conditions that are more one-offs, and it'll just make it more difficult to really find maybe some of the causes and the best conditions for future health?
That's a great question. We were pretty. It happened in the middle of our collection of data, so we were kind of concerned that it might throw some things off. So I've been trying on iNaturalist. When someone reports a tree is browning canopy because of heat damage, we rather keep it marked as healthy and then acknowledge that the tree has heat damage, so that it's consistent with the other observations. So we've been just trying to be proactive about how those are getting documented. But with that, we are trying to document where the heat damage did occur on red cedar. So there's a question for that, because it does seem like red cedar is the kind of the only cedar where you see that scorching. But I agree, you see it on Douglas fir and western hemlock too. And the real impact of the heat dome and that effect kind of depends on whether that tree had produced buds or not. I think red cedar is unique in the sense that it doesn't really have buds and this like annual growth like that. It kind of continually grows. Sometimes faster than others. But say if that scorched all the new foliage before the Douglas fir put out their buds, then that could be pretty detrimental for 2 years of growth. But really, I think, ultimately it's just slowing down the growth of those trees. I don't know if it's really killed anything. Our rhododendrons, like the leaves got fried and then it just dropped the leaves and we'll put out new leaves. But if this happens all the time, it could be an issue. And whether that makes them more vulnerable to other diseases or something like that is another question. But one thing that was raised to us, and it's really anecdotal, it was just one observation out of Mercer, but someone was concerned that the heat damage may have weakened the branch strength on their red cedar as it dropped its branch, a pretty big limb during the heat event. And so that's something that would be concerning, is whether, the trees kind of lose their tensile strength or without, so there's a lot we don't know about how the heat is really going to affect these trees. And thinking about the heat dome as well, Paul, it's really good comment. Just like we had the heat dome and that extreme event, we could also have an extreme cold event, right? And so we could have the opposite extreme event. And this is like where we really need to be paying attention and trying to document what's happening, because there's a lot of eager people to plant California redwoods or coast redwoods or some, other species. And if we had an extreme cold event, we don't know how those will do. But the only way we'll understand that is if we all collect data and share observations after those events so that we can learn from them. So I really like that you brought that up. Thanks, Paul. Did I answer everything?
Yeah, thanks so much. I know as a scientist collecting data, the cleanliness of your data is going to be very key to the statistical analysis that you do. So as we collect and offer some of our data to you to kind of help, like you said, filter out and understand what we're really seeing versus something that may be more symptomatic of the problem we're trying to identify, all of that should help.
Yeah, and that's that illustrates why it's really great to engage with you all. You are clearly very very thoughtful and would be great contributors to this because you're thinking and asking those questions. And so your perspectives are super important, and I would love to engage with you all more. I would say that people that generally participate are pretty open to training and things. So we might correct one observation on iNaturalist, but then there's second observations improved. So we're very much in this as like a trying to build skills and things like that too, and not just have it be like a one-off. I'd love to have more trainings, and I'd love to get out there with you all. I wish I could do that with everyone. But you're absolutely right. We got to be somewhat careful. iNaturalist is great in the sense that the community kind of checks the observations, and often someone will post an unhealthy picture, then somebody will say, oh, you should add this to this project, and like that's really great too. So the community is really incredible on iNaturalist, but we do ask people to like take pictures of the cones. And if there's no cones, the underside of the foliage, so that we can be sure it's a red cedar, for example. Sometimes you might find an Alaska yellow cedar or Port Orford cedar getting added, and so we can be more cautious and careful about whether we're actually documenting red cedar just by having the right pictures. So that's one way that we try and increase data quality too. It's great questions.
Do you have any other questions?
Yeah, well, I'm happy to hang out for a little longer, but you all are certainly welcome to email me, of course. Engage with me during an office hour, come to one of our other trainings, sign up to meet in the field at some point. Then you can ask me as many questions as you want. But yeah, looks like Paul, go ahead. Thanks.
Well, yeah, thanks for the other opportunity. Yeah, I just completed reading Susan Simard's book, In Search of the Mother Tree. And it's very interesting, her focus on soil and the soil conditions and the fungus and all of that. She talks quite a bit about there being communities of trees and different species actually helping one another. And so in this kind of data collection for the red cedar, if you mentioned it and I missed it, I apologize, but is there anything about like what else is nearby? What other plants or species or fungus or bushes or whatever that may contribute to the overall long-term health of a cedar tree? Is that part of the data collection, or is there anything in this area we should maybe be aware of?
That's such a good point. And you're actually the second person to suggest that. So I think that means that I should be doing that. At this time, we didn't want to have there's already a lot of questions, and most of them are optional because we recognize that there's too many. we'd love to include more, like what other plant species do you have? And one option, Paul, might be to, like, when we're out together, we have more of a specific hypothesis that we can test on a smaller scale in Issaquah area. Like, for example, red cedars next to Salal are going to be less healthy than red cedars next to some other species. And that the reason I say Salal is because we know it's kind of a drier, it does well in drier sites than, say, sword fern maybe. So that might indicate that that's a drier site and the red cedar might be less healthy. And I'd love to, like, investigate that more thoroughly with the community, like you all. At this point, we don't have it on there. What we do have, though, is a question: did you see any other unhealthy trees or any other unhealthy species? And then we ask you to note. So if there's, for example, a big leaf maple that's really unhealthy next to it, or if you see a Douglas fir that's dying. Actually, if there's like a Douglas fir next to a red cedar that's unhealthy, if they're both unhealthy, that might be a good indicator that there's armillaria. But it's also interesting to think about what trees are not there. So it would be helpful to have that more robust data, because if there's no Douglas fir there, that might indicate that it's in a root rot pocket too. Because Douglas fir is more susceptible. But yeah, actually, so Stephen had messaged me. He says, he'd love to hear my recommendation for like what to replant. And that's just, it's difficult, it's hard to recommend. Someone also asked me that, like, which tree you highlighted all these trees that are having trouble, but what tree is not having trouble, or which tree are you not concerned about? And so I think my recommendation, the best recommendation, is to plant diversity, so that you don't have all your trees die from one cause, right? So if you only have red cedar on your property, and we find out that you're in a vulnerable site and there's this prediction for this area, then you might want to plant other species too. If you only have maples and this maple disease turns out to be an issue, that could be bad. Really, you just want to have a mix. You want to have as much stuff as you can, so that you're more resilient to these things that pop up. But yeah, also experiment, and then let me know what works and what doesn't. We'd love to have more network of like what other people are doing, and what's working and what's not. What failed after heat dome and what did well. But we need a little more coordination there, and that's where you all could be really, really influential. So I hope that answered your question, Stephen. Yeah, you all are incredible. Mountain to Sounds Greenway. So we're not partnered with them directly. I would love to be, but we definitely like interact through other channels. So for example, they have a really cool project that they're collaborating with the Northwest Natural Resource Group on, I think, and the Seattle City Light, where they're experimenting with different seed zones and different populations. And they've even planted like some incense cedar. And so they're kind of experimenting in this place called Stossel Creek. I think if you Google Stossel, I think Mountains to Sound is involved in that.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah, thanks. And so that's pretty cool. They're definitely doing thinking like what, trying to think ahead and plan ahead. And so we're in touch via that. I would love to work with them to expand kind of what they're working on beyond just the one site, and look at more diversity of site conditions and things. Also, I do want to caution you when you're thinking like what's going to do well on my ground in the future. Think like 30 years out. Don't think 100 years out, because you're probably whatever you plant that's supposed to do well 100 years from now is not going to do well until 100 years from now. If that makes sense. Where if you think more short term and just kind of experiment, you that's a better advice, I think. Cool. Okay. Yeah, some folks are direct messaging me, which is great. Sounds like some folks are planning on joining for the hike and engaging more in the Forest Health Watch stuff. I totally welcome you all. As I've mentioned a few times, you are the audience that we want to work with closely because you're so switched on and turned on about the right things and the right questions, and you're the ones out there on the ground seeing things, and your perspectives are really important. If you see stuff, let us know so that we know how to take it forward and amplify that or address that. But yeah, thanks for all the positive notes in the chat, and I really appreciate you spending your Thursday evening with me. And so thanks to the Squaw Alps Trail Club for hosting, especially Hannah and Anne. It's really a great opportunity, and I'm really privileged to have your support and be here and engage with you all. So thank you all for your time and support.
Thank you again, Joey. This was really informative. I'm also getting some nice messages in my chat about it. So yeah, I am excited for however many of you want to kind of jump on board and become citizen scientists.
Yeah, feel free to contact me for questions and things like that. Otherwise, we'll hopefully see you around Issaquah soon.
We can hang out for a couple more minutes. If anyone else has questions. Yeah, otherwise have a good night.
Hey, thanks, Joey. Thanks, Hannah.
Thanks, Paul.
Yeah, nice to speak with you.
Cheers.
Thanks, guys. That was really awesome. I appreciate your time.
You're welcome, Randall. Thanks for coming.
Lots of good resources there too. You got me excited.
Good.
Cheers. Have a good one, guys.
Bye.
Thank you.
Is Jana Wall working on this at all? She's killed more holly and ivy than anybody else in the world, I think, and has been very concerned about some of the cedar trees that she planted like 15, 20 years ago or even longer that are now dying. And she's very, very concerned, and she's a smart scientist type person that would really do well to be involved with this.
She was signed up for the event tonight. I didn't see her join us, but I'm going to send, we recorded the meeting here. I can stop recording.